What's going on is, and this isn't the first time, is that our national economy is hurting because of these kinds of initiatives, or these kinds of events. We bring hundreds of thousands of gallons or liters of oil into this country every day, but we don't export our own. And we don't use our own as much as we should and as much as we could, because it's politically incorrect, and there's an orchestrated and concentrated effort underway to stop the development of Canadian natural resources.
Across the country today, dozens of rallies are being held protesting Ottawa's decision to buy the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
We need to get our resources to new markets, plain and simple. That's why our government made the decision to buy the pipeline and its proposed expansion.
But as oil prices dropped almost 60% in the last 2 years, 40,000 people were fired from the industry.
So when we're sitting here talking academically about the middle class and about what's happening, this is where the rubber hits the road.
Nowadays, what we have in terms of our modern lives, convenience, access to information, the internet made possible by oil and gas.
The people in my riding, where's the economic considerations for all of the punitive policies they put against Alberta energy companies? The role of a prime minister is to unite our country. All jobs are important. You should stand for justice.
My story begins in a small place called Harvey Station. It is a rural community outside the city of Fredericton in New Brunswick. My parents raised me on a small hobby farm, and life for me was very simple and somewhat sheltered. We have so many memories growing up on the farm. My brother and I were always required to help out with the animals and to do our daily chores. We were incredibly blessed to be surrounded by nature and by New Brunswick's beauty. It is something, now that I'm older, I really value in my upbringing. Before I moved to Alberta, I studied social work at St. Thomas University. During my social work degree, New Brunswickers were protesting against oil and gas development and fracking. I supported the fracking ban even though I wasn't properly informed. I didn't believe that you could balance both business and environmental standards. I also thought that the oil and gas industry was irrelevant and was being phased out of Canada.
My name's Cody Battersill. I'm the founder of CanadaAction.ca. We're a federally registered nonprofit that advocates for informed conversations about our natural resource sector. Fossil fuels today are the world's primary energy source. Fossil fuels are also called hydrocarbons. Oil, natural gas, coal are the primary fossil fuels. You know, really when you think about it, everything that we are wearing, everything that we're looking at, everything in our homes, everything we eat, everything we've ever done has been made possible by natural resources, and fossil fuels have been a vast primary part of that.
Fossil fuels is a term used to describe a group of energy sources that were formed when ancient plants and organisms were subject to intense heat and pressure over millions of years. This began during the Carboniferous period, prior to the age of the dinosaurs. Fossil fuels are sought-after energy sources because they have a high energy density.
Nowadays, what we have in terms of our modern lives, convenience, access to information, the internet made possible by oil and gas due to the energy, the plastics, the materials, the power. So, you know, our lives would be fundamentally different.
It's hard to imagine a life without fossil fuels. So much of what we do, not only in our cars and heating our homes, relies on fossil fuels. It's our clothes, it's plastics, it's medicines. It's impossible to imagine our life today without fossil fuels. Impossible.
So when you look at the world, it is all reliant upon natural resources, everything we do.
This whole debate, particularly here in Canada where we live such a privileged life, it's become, you know, no oil and gas, it should be all renewable, it should be all that. Both Canada and the world doesn't have that luxury. We need every form of energy. We need tidal, we need geothermal, we need solar, we need wind, we need nuclear, we need oil and gas. It's all of the above. This world needs huge amounts of energy. We need every form of energy possible. for most of the world, they live in energy scarcity, various degrees of energy scarcity. As you get down to lower and lower access to energy, your standard of living decreases, your life expectancy decreases, your education decreases, your chance of death from respiratory failure increases because you're burning cruder and cruder forms of energy. And there's close to 1 billion people in this world, close to 1 billion out of 7.5, who use the primary sources of energy as coal, wood, and cow dung. In 2018, people on this planet are still burning cow dung.
Global demand for oil and gas will continue to grow based on global consumption measured by the KI Identity Formula. This formula highlights the complexity of lowering global CO2 emissions. In order to achieve a low-carbon economy, factors such as population growth, GDP per capita, energy demand, and carbon intensity all play vital roles in this equation.
The demand for every kind of energy is increasing because the world needs so much energy. There's a lot of talk, again, particularly here in Canada, where we're so privileged to have abundant energy that the time of oil and gas has peaked, it's over, it's on the decline. And people think that from a very Canadian perspective. You know, they see their neighbor buy a Prius and everybody loves a Tesla, but people look at it and they say, obviously oil has peaked. The demand for oil continues to increase. It passed 100 million barrels a day for the first time in the world a couple of months ago. Next year it'll be 102, then 104. It continues to increase because this world needs energy. The demand for every kind of energy is increasing.
By us not developing our resources, we are actually causing sort of a net environmental negative globally, because other countries are picking up where we left off, and they're going to continue to fill that gap that we leave behind.
Canada uses twice as much energy as other countries for a number of reasons. The average Western country, the developed world, uses about 34 barrels of oil a year per person, and that's all forms of energy expressed as oil. Canada uses about 67 barrels of oil per person per year. And there's a few reasons for that. We're a big country. Transportation is important. We travel a lot. It takes a lot of energy to transport by rail, by truck. We're a cold nation. Heating is obviously important. And also we participate in many energy-intensive industries. Oil and gas is an energy-intensive industry, so is mining, so is agriculture, so is producing fertilizers, potash, so is producing steel, so is producing aluminum, producing cars, planes. All these things are energy-intensive industries. And of course the final reason, and the reason we all enjoy, is we have such a high standard of living. We all enjoy a high standard of living here in Canada, and we travel a lot. We travel a lot for pleasure, to go skiing, to go camping, to go play hockey, take our kids to gymnastics, to ballet, whatever. All of that takes energy, so we consume a lot of energy. Your standard of living and your access and use of energy are directly related. The higher your energy consumption, the higher your standard of living. Of course, we see that primarily in the people who come here and criticize our industry. The very wealthy, the 0.01% who live a phenomenally high standard of living, their access to energy, yachts, private jets, is something beyond most of our comprehension. Yet they come here and criticize the energy industry. And these people aren't foolish. They're smart people. They're just not that well informed. I don't think they realize just how much of their lifestyle is dependent on abundant energy. Well, when I think of people objecting to the oil and gas industry in Canada, the name that's most often used is Mr. Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know him. I have certainly nothing against him. He's been to Alberta filming movies. He's criticized the oil and gas industry. At the same time, he and his friends rented a boat in 2014 in the harbor in Rio de Janeiro to watch the 2014 World Cup of Soccer. They stayed there while they traveled around to the various soccer games. So I looked up the yacht Topaz. It's 480 feet long. It's a football field and a half long. It has two 8,000 horsepower diesel engines that can propel that ship at 22 knots, which for a ship is really fast. It has a staff of 79. It holds 60 guests. It costs $650 million to build, $650 million. It has two helipads on it, one on the bow and one on the stern. and they don't land traffic helicopters on there. These are large helicopters. When you're living in that kind of energy abundance, it's really easy to say what other people should be doing. But he lives that life because he has access to abundant, cheap energy. As I say, I have nothing against him. I'm sure he's a perfectly intelligent individual. I don't think he appreciates the connection between his life and abundant, cheap energy.
You know, we need to have a zero tolerance policy for misrepresentation, for defamation, for slander against the industry. You know, and if a news organization pulls a photo of an oil sands mine and says that this is the whole industry, that's false and misleading. We need to correct that. If a celebrity wants to fly up and refuses to take the time to get a balanced perspective from people that are not paid to spread a narrative of fear and disinformation, then that person needs to be publicly called out by our highest levels of our elected officials. You know, that you cannot come to this country and selectively absorb information that you then share with your following that creates the wrong, inaccurate perception about Canada and how we do things.
So what are your personal views on climate change?
It's such a confusing topic. I personally am a believer. We've been pumping high volumes of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere for probably close to 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. It's hard to imagine pumping that much of anything into the atmosphere without having an impact, so I'm a believer. I also believe we can't be wrong. How much are we willing to bet that it's not the cause? We can't afford to be wrong, so we do have to act on it. But that's where things get difficult. Under how do we act on it, at what pace, to what degree, who's responsible? Everybody right now points to the other guy. The whole environmental movement points to the other guy. Those people should do something, those people should do something. It's a lot harder when we have to look at what we have to do, and that's when it gets very challenging.
With a population over 36 million per capita, Canada is the 10th largest carbon emitter. However, Canada in total only accounts for roughly 1.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. China is roughly 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The United States is 15%, European Union 9%, India 7%, Russia 5%, and Japan 4%.
Yeah, greenhouse gas emissions is an important conversation and Canada's role in that. So there's a number of different metrics. You know, Canada's approximately 1.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Out to 2040, oil and gas will still be the primary source of energy on the planet, not just in Canada, not just in North America. If we're going to meet Paris, we're going to have more renewables, for sure. Solar, wind, tidal will play a bigger role. Nuclear has to play a bigger role. Oil and gas, though, will still be about 50% of the world's energy supply. So two things have to change in order to meet Paris goals in 2040. We have to reduce the amount of coal we use, and we have to increase the efficiency in what we do. With those two, and a change in the mix, meaning more nuclear, more renewables, Paris goals can be achieved. It's a very high bar, though.
The oil sands, which is a real poster child, been made a real poster child by environmentalists and by celebrities. It's not the dirtiest oil in the world. It's not the dirtiest oil in North America. It's actually, there's many oil sands projects that are actually producing oil with better emissions than a number of other sources of oil coming into the US and coming into Europe and Asia. So you look at the oil sands just as one example, right? So it's about, 0.15%. When we talk about emissions, global shipping is roughly 2%. And a big one, data centers. People watching this right now, watching it through the internet, watching it online, on their phone, on their laptop, or on their TV, that's all made possible by the Internet of Things, by information, technology, and communications through the internet, data farms, Facebook, Apple, Google. These things are made possible by the internet. And the internet and the data farms that run it, our social media accounts, that's more emissions than all of Canada.
According to the International Telecommunications Union, there were 44.3 million metric tons of electronic waste in 2017. According to the ITU, only 1.9% of e-waste generated in North and South America was recycled.
People look at Suncor, a big emitter. They are a big emitter. And they're working on that. They're very open about their emissions, their sustainability report. People look upon Apple as a high-tech, clean company. They have solar panels on their roof. But Apple emits about 40% more than Suncor. Now, partially because it's a bigger company, but partially because everything they do requires a lot of energy, and they are a large emitter. And once again, energy is not easy. If it was easy and these answers were easy, it'd all be done by now.
According to the World Bank, global waste production accounted for about 5% of global emissions in 2016. Global waste generation could increase 70% by 2050 due to increased population as well as demand for products.
Supply and demand influence the price of any product. Typically, the more scarce something is, i.e. the lower supply there is, the more valuable it'll be, as long as there's a demand for that product. So the two concepts really are intertwined in determining the price of any given product. Oil in particular, crude oil is the single largest traded commodity in the world. So it has a huge impact. And oil and gas both are really inputs to transportation, obviously, and power generation. So to the extent that those things are cheaper, that would allow consumers to use that money for other things. So if you have cheaper power, for example, your power bill goes down, now you have money to spend on other things. So there's a trickle-down effect into the broader economy.
Well, ultimately, the use of energy comes down to the consumer, us as citizens. There's so much pressure on the oil and gas companies to reduce their emissions, and they have to. None of us get a free pass here. None of us get a get-out-of-jail-free card. We all have to reduce our emissions. Right now, the focus is on the energy companies, and at the end of the day, depending what you want to add in, we're 10 to 20% of the emissions of a barrel of oil. But over 80%, any way you look at it, is with the consumer. And that's from buying a new iPhone or whatever product, because it takes energy to produce those, to our own travels, going on our Mexico or Hawaii or Caribbean vacation, traveling around this great country. All of that takes energy. And I'll use an example. How many people have had this discussion around their dining room table? Kids, we were going to go to Disneyland this year on a holiday, and that sounds really exciting, and that could be lots of fun. How about instead of going to Disneyland, we put an extra foot of insulation in our attic, and we replace our old double glazed windows with brand new triple glazed, low E argon filled thermal windows. How exciting is that, kids? What do you think? It's not that exciting, but if we're really going to reduce emissions, we have to look at the consumer, us, how we behave, how we act, and change the way we act. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And that's why this debate is so easy to when it's what the other person has to do. It gets much more complicated when you have to look at what we have to do.
When you think about things more globally, there are places in the world, countries in the world, where the main source of their revenue is hydrocarbons, whether it be oil or gas. Those countries are typically exporting to consuming countries, places like the United States, China, etc., where they don't have the supply within their own borders to satisfy the demand that their consumers have. So it all is kind of intertwined in the broader economy. So if the economic growth is much stronger in a particular country, let's say China, for example, typically their thirst for energy goes up. So the amount of gas or oil that they're going to have to import will go up, and that'll affect ultimately those commodity prices as well.
I mean, I think people need to understand a couple of things. One is just, how much of the economic growth in Canada is driven by the oil and gas sector. And I think, it's difficult to understand those statistics because we import stuff, we export stuff, and you really need to look at kind of the net of what we do. So autos, for example, we export a tremendous amount of economic value in terms of auto parts and autos, but we import more. So the net contribution in terms of that balance of trade that I talked about earlier is actually a negative number. Now, that sector provides a lot of jobs in Ontario, but it doesn't have the same impact on the broader Canadian economy in the sense that it is not impacting that balance of trade the same way the oil and gas sector does. So I think people need to understand kind of the economics of different industries a little bit better. So maybe there's a role for the federal government to kind of provide more clarity on how much economic contribution is made by different sectors. I mean, the oil and gas sector accounts for 5 or 6% of Canada's GDP directly. Then you think about the indirect contributions that can be made from the oil and gas business here in Canada.
But it is. If you think of the Canadian economy contracting, say, by 5%, that would be a massive recession. That would be a depression. But yeah, I mean, obviously the recession had a massive impact here in Calgary, particularly because the first place that companies chose to cut costs was in their administrative infrastructure, which is mostly here in downtown Calgary. But I think Canadians didn't understand exactly what a big impact that was across Canada. If you imagine a typical sort of middle-class family, perhaps working in a large company, perhaps with a pension fund, for example. The decline in the values of oil stocks massively impacted these people's retirement accounts. We talked about the oil and gas industry being about 5% of the Canadian GDP, but it's about 25% of the Canadian stock market. So that makes a huge difference. So when those stocks came down, that makes a big difference in everybody's RRSP, perhaps their pension plan, whatever, and it takes money away from Canadians who could otherwise spend it on other things and help boost the economy. So it was sort of ironic at the time when people in other provinces, after boom years in Alberta for so long, people in other provinces finally were kind of saying, good, you guys deserve it, it's been good for long enough, without realizing it negatively impacts them as well.
Four months after I moved to Alberta, I began working as a receptionist for an energy company and later moved into the surface land department. During the peak of the recession in downtown Calgary a couple years ago, the climate was so incredibly intense in our community. The office buildings especially were really hit in corporate downtown Calgary. The employees essentially were walking down the hallways, not talking to each other, doors were shut all the time. I was fortunate enough to have a waitressing job to fall back on. Severance packages can only last so long. I can't imagine what that was like for a family with children.
A lot of empty desks on one downtown block tonight. Nearly 1,000 people who had been working in buildings on 9th Avenue lost their jobs today. The sting of a slumping oil patch now feeling oh so real for all of those families.
At the end of the day, this isn't just about the workers in Calgary. The natural resource sector provides wealth and prosperity, government revenue, stability to the entire country. We should be seeking to leverage the wealth and opportunity that comes out of that sector into other sectors, clean technology, service industries. But the contraction and that instability that has seen our sector just completely change in terms of its ability to attract investment is deeply concerning. And I think one agenda has been filled, and a lot of people in Canada have suffered because of that.
In Canada, our environmental standards are guided by a regulatory framework called the National Energy Board, or NEB. Most of the NEB's responsibilities are set out in the National Energy Board Act, the Canada Oil and Gas Operations Act, and the Canada Petroleum Resources Act. The board regulates pipelines, power lines, and the import and export of oil and gas. Projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline and Energy East are either approved or denied according to these acts. The body that regulates energy resource development in Alberta is called the Alberta Energy Regulator, or AER.
Canada is truly a leader in protecting people and the planet when it comes to natural resource production, and that's resource production across the country. When we think about beef, that's a natural resource. Farmed salmon, natural resource. Fishing, natural resource. Uranium, for nuclear power, we're a top producer. Farming, we are one of the world's bread baskets. We help feed the world. We're a leading exporter of mustard, blueberries, cranberries, chicken, pork products, wood products, oil and natural gas, Canada's largest single export. So when you look coast to coast, you can't make a wind farm without coal, because coal is responsible for 70% of the world's steel production. You need about 150 tons of coal to make the steel for a single onshore wind farm, but 250 tons for an offshore wind farm. And Canada's a leader. So when you look at the world's top 10 oil exporters, just for one example, we are a leader across 20 to 25 different metrics of quality, environmental protection, environmental innovation, renewables, clean tech, environmental spending. The oil and gas industry, for one quick example, spends more than any other industry in Canada protecting the environment. And we should really be proud.
Canada does have some of the strictest environmental standards with respect to oil and gas production in the world. It has been a leader. There has been other countries come to Canada to learn about how to safely produce oil and gas. I know specifically of examples where, there were oil and gas companies and government officials from Russia, for example, coming over to understand how our system works, what our regulatory framework works like, etc. So, other countries around the world have looked to Canada for leadership in that regard, and I think we've done a very good job providing that, particularly what is now called the Alberta Energy Regulator, which superseded two previous organizations, the Alberta Energy Utilities Board and the ERCB.
And I think one of the things that Canada can offer the world is political stability in terms of a regulatory environment, a taxation environment, as well as a politically stable environment in which products and services can be built out and implemented. I think the challenge that we've seen in recent years under a Liberal government is some of the erosion of that stability. I think one of the competitive advantages that Canada has had in the past is that coupling of an abundance of natural resources with a political will and a framework in which to see that develop. And some of my concerns has been that that's actually changed in recent years, as we've seen and evidenced by foreign direct investment being removed from the country in this regard.
We have so much innovation happening in the oil and gas sector to reduce emissions. We have some of the best flaring and methane regulations in the world. The oil and gas sector has been a huge investor in renewables in Canada.
Every oil and gas company I know, I can't speak for every company, but everyone I know, and I know a lot, are working as hard as they can to improve their emission standards as well, to lower their emissions. I know at Modern, we have developed what we call mule sites, modern ultra-low emission sites. On our sites, we've taken our methane emissions and not just reduced them, but eliminated them entirely. We're very proud of that technology. We share it with other companies because it's not a modern issue, it's a global issue. But we're very proud of what we're doing. So are other companies. This industry is doing many great things to reduce emissions.
The Alberta Energy Regulator is involved at every stage of an energy project's life cycle. This includes planning, construction, operation, and reclamation. Their role is to keep energy companies accountable for both worker safety and environmental standards. The AER audits sites through an integrated compliance assurance framework. This means that companies that do not comply with the regulatory standards can face prosecution or what's called a declaration. According to the AER, declarations prevent a person or company that continues to breach standards from owning or operating an energy company in Alberta.
Canada has two of the world's largest commercialized carbon capture and storage projects. We should be celebrating that. We should be trying to export that technology and that knowledge and that know-how to the whole world.
If you're a board of director member sitting around the table of a major natural resource company or energy infrastructure company, you are making decisions that are related to the employment of tens of thousands of people, but also you're really assessing risk, right? Because these projects aren't small. They're big capital investments. And one of the things that you would be looking at are the determinants to investment on whether or not this is going to create wealth and be stable over time. So these are things like, do we have a regulatory environment that isn't going to create surprises or change the operating context over time? Is there an adequate supply of skilled labor? Do we have a taxation environment that is going to remain stable? Because when you're talking about these big investments that touch so many people and so many people's lives, that stability, that predictableness needs to happen.
The competitiveness conversation for both the environment and business is very, very important. So we are really tied into the United States. They're our largest trading partner. There's something like 30 states, 35 states maybe. Their largest trading partner is Canada. So we need to be consistently benchmarking our tax rates, regulatory regimes, and overall business competitiveness to the United States. We're seeing right now so many companies that were pillars of Canadian business that are actually shifting and moving down to the US, investing in the US. A really sad example is Canada's two largest pipeline companies, when their pipeline projects were obstructed and canceled, Energy East and Northern Gateway, they invested more than $50 billion Canadian in the United States buying two American pipeline companies. TransCanada, unfortunately, is in the final stages of changing their name to take Canada out. And that's a precursor to them shifting employment down to Houston, unfortunately, and potentially moving their head office because there's better tax rates in the US than there are in Canada. And when you have a regulatory gridlock in a country that doesn't seem to care about oil and gas and business in general, and this isn't just the oil and gas sector that's raising the alarm on competitiveness. This is RBC, Scotiabank, National Bank, big banks, BlackBerry. You know, this is potash and fertilizer companies. This is wood companies and wood associations, mining, oil and gas, bankers, money managers, and foreign investors that are all raising the alarm. There's recently a letter from a US-based investor. This fund manages $1.7 trillion. To put that in context, Canada's annual economy is $1.68 trillion. This fund manages more money than our entire economy in a year. They sent a letter to our federal government outlining they're raising the alarm on their concerns. They have tens of billions of dollars invested in Canada, and that's the trend that we're seeing from investors. Canada's not going in the right direction. We're not competitive. We've created regulatory gridlock. We've added complexity and layers of unnecessary burden to business. With some of these new pieces of legislation in the federal government right now, we won't see another pipeline project proposed. There's no certainty for business. Business will simply say, you know what, Canada, I'm going to move to the US. Statoil, here's another good example. They operate in more than 30 countries around the world. They changed their name. They're now called Equinor. Equinor, when they were Statoil, they invested in Alberta, maybe about $4 billion. They operate in 30 countries around the world. Greenpeace pressured them to sell their dirty Canadian oil over a multi-year period. Finally, the Norwegian parliament voted, in the face of that political pressure, to sell Alberta. They did not sell Algeria, Venezuela, the US, Brazil, all these other countries that don't have carbon pricing initiatives, that aren't transparent for resource governance, that don't share our values for equality and human rights and worker safety and environmental protection.
I believe that we can have and provide that stability to industry while having world-class environmental regulations. I think anybody would be hard-pressed to argue that Canada has not been one of the world leaders in environmental standards. I mean, a lot of people will say, well, let's just compare Canada to, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, but it's not just about comparing Canada to other places in the world where, frankly, we buy oil from, but we don't have those standards. It's also we're just above and beyond.
You know, on the LNG file, when we take Canadian gas from British Columbia or from Western Canada and we export that to Asia or Europe, we're actually reducing emissions globally. Even if emissions in BC are up a small amount, we're reducing emissions by a much larger percentage by getting our gas to the rest of the world. It's actually a far shorter travel time from the west coast of BC to Asia than it is from the US Gulf Coast, as one example. It's like something like half the distance. So there's less time on the ship, and we have really, really top-notch, world-class, world-leading standards. So that's one example. When we take, for example, SEGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage, and we add solvents and we add infill wells and we add other technological innovations that have been made and advanced in Canada to that process, you can actually produce oil for about 50 years in the oil sands from a SEGD facility. The surface disturbance is about 4 football fields. The below-ground reservoir that's accessed is over 100 football fields. And when you're on pad 10, you won't even know pad 1 existed because it will already be replanted with trees and it will already have been reclaimed. Well, there's innovations happening in the SEGD industry and in the oil sands in situ industry to, again, reduce emissions. And that's a technology we can export all over the world. That's innovation we can export all over the world.
Natural gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel. For transport and storage, natural gas is pressurized and becomes liquefied natural gas, commonly referred to as LNG.
I think that for many years, Canada was able to have a very robust environmental review process. And I think that the narrative around the efficacy of those standards has been hijacked by people who would just seek to have the natural resource sector not be developed writ large.
On the sort of conventional side, you know, when you look at natural gas, you look at oil, you look at hydraulic fracturing, right? Hydraulic fracturing has been used for decades. And on the hydraulic fracturing side, you know, a continued shift towards water recycling and a continued shift towards reducing land disturbance through pad drilling, and then also reclaiming that land when that pad is drilled and when those wells are done. Alberta is also a leader in the world in having a fully industry-funded orphan well program, and that's something that most people don't know. And there's always room for improvement on all of these things, but that's a balanced approach, is acknowledging that there's room for improvement and we're going to work towards that. That's the Canadian way.
You'll notice this, it's evidenced by the debate on the environmental regulatory process. That debate is not quantitative. It doesn't talk about, well, this regulation or lack of scrutiny results in X. It's just, we need to change everything. And to me, that's a problem because it erodes that industry confidence that we need to see projects built out. Canada has right now some of the best standards in terms of mitigation planning requirements, responses to potential issues related to our natural resource sector, cumulative impact assessments, reclamation plans. These are all things, corporate social responsibility is something that is embedded into the operations of any natural resource company or energy infrastructure company in Canada right now. So I don't think, and I've never thought that it has to be a trade-off between the environment and the economy. I think, in fact, that's something that set Canada apart. What's happened recently is that we have seen that decoupling, and we've traded industrial certainty for, just political rhetoric.
So we've experienced over the last 10 years this campaign to demarket Canadian energy, to create fear and disinformation about what we do and how we do it and what the impacts are. And this campaign tells people, Canadians and the world, that we don't need oil and gas, Canada's an environmental laggard, and there's no economic benefits anyways, and that's false, false, and false.
And even though Canada does have a regionalized economy, we are a national economy and a national framework.
So why would Canada be selling oil and gas at a discount? It really is simply a market force at play. We have one consumer of our oil and gas. That's the United States of America. 99% of our oil and gas is exported to the United States of America.
I mean, the main reason I think is the one that we see in the media all the time, and that is just a lack of market access. Behind that is the fact that the United States, which has been our primary export market, has become our largest competitor for natural gas and crude oil. So they have done an amazing about-face in terms of their own production and grown their shale gas production, the shale oil production at a very dramatic rate over the last 5 years. And so consequently, they need less of our product. And our pipeline interconnects really only are to the United States. So we really don't have any other markets to send our products to today. And so that's really causing a disconnect from world oil and natural gas prices because we can't access those other markets. And even to the extent, the United States would like more of our oil, we can't even get it there unless we move it by higher cost, less environmentally friendly means such as rail.
The primary cause in this massive discount is lack of pipelines, a lack of infrastructure, a lack of egress, too much supply and not enough physical infrastructure to move that supply to the demand markets. Now, when we go back over the last 50, 60 years, really in the modern era of Canada's oil and gas industry, we have one customer, and that's the United States.
We are at the mercy of our one customer. So if you had only one customer, that person can pretty much decide what they want to pay for things.
We really have no competition. And whenever you get into an environment where you only have one purchaser of your goods, they're the ones that can set the price. They're the price setter, we're the price taker. And obviously they're going to discount us as much as possible. And the result of that, and the result of having even going to the United States insufficient pipeline capacity means that we're constantly suffering deep price discounts. And the order of magnitude of that should stun and shock Canadians. Statistics produced by a lot of reputable forecasters in Canada, including the Canadian banks, talk about 15 to $30 billion a year lost to the Canadian economy, not because we're not producing resources, but we're simply not getting the right economic rent for that resource. Imagine that amount of money. That amount of money, just to put it in perspective, would more than balance the Canadian budget, would produce a massive surplus, would allow significant tax cuts, would allow us to pay teachers more, social workers more, all the good things that Canadians want.
We have the highest environmental standards in the world, but we're selling the world's cheapest oil. We have seen over the last 10 years, the United States and Australia have become two of the world's top 5 natural gas exporters. And we are just now finally building our first large LNG facility. And it's really our loss and it's other countries' gain because we sell them cheaper resources. We also then aren't forcing other countries to compete with Canada globally.
And I think probably the biggest thing is we are adopting stricter environmental policies and tax policies and regulatory standards than they are in the United States. So that is putting us at a disadvantage. It's allowing the United States to grow at a much more cost-efficient pace than we can achieve in Canada, and with less environmental oversight. In fact, it's ironic in some respects that we're importing natural gas and crude oil into Canada, which doesn't pay any carbon taxes. So we're supporting the production of oil and gas outside of Canada, which is being produced under less strict environmental standards.
Well, a really interesting question is not only why are we getting paid too little for a resource, but what leverage are we giving up by having only one consumer? Well, very simply, the original free trade agreement that we did with the United States back in 1987 was done for one reason only: our resources. The United States really wasn't interested in doing free trade with Canada or much else of what we had to offer. I was party to those negotiations, and it was a very, very difficult deal to do, but it got done for one reason, and that was because the United States wanted exclusive access to our resource, because they wanted it for security, energy security. It's just like having a military. If you don't have energy security, you're vulnerable.
World demand for natural gas is expected to increase 45% by 2040, driven primarily by rapidly expanding Asian economies.
They wanted energy security. They wanted access to our resources. We've now given them all of our resources. No competition for those resources. Pipelines only going to the United States of America. So as we would say on the farm, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? And right now, the Americans have our energy security. So when we're doing free trade negotiations, we do it without that leverage, without them saying, oh, we've got to do a free trade deal with Canada so that we can get access to oil and gas. They don't feel that way anymore because they have access to oil and gas and they know we can't put it anywhere else. It gives them all the leverage.
You'll know that this cannot be done safely. And it's really questionable that there are any real employment or economic benefits to fracking.
The resource industry in Canada is one of the biggest generators of wealth in Canada. If you look at the export balance of payments, we've been running large surpluses, which has allowed Canada to somewhat decouple from the United States as far as interest rates are concerned and maintain a stronger Canadian dollar. So if you think about exports, oil and gas actually make the largest contribution to the net exports out of Canada. It's not the auto sector, it's not forest products, it's oil and gas. And so if the value of that product goes down, that reduces our balance of trade with the United States. That causes us to have to actually increase interest rates to support our dollar, particularly if we want to raise debt to finance public infrastructure development. So lower oil and gas prices, lower value for our product actually causes interest rates in Canada to go up and depreciates the value of our Canadian dollar.
So why should all provinces care about this inability to get our resources to market? Well, for 2 or 3 reasons. One, this is a national wealth, and the money is shared nationally. Equalization money that flows into Atlantic Canada and Quebec flows out of Western Canada in large measure. And the success of Western Canada should be important to the success of Quebec and Atlantic Canada. Quebec, for example, gets as much as $8 billion in equalization. They should care about how well Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan and other Western provinces are doing. They should care a lot.
The basic principle of equalization payments, sometimes called transfer payments, has been present since the dawn of Canadian Federation. The purpose of the program is to address fiscal disparities among provinces, allowing for a universal standard of public services such as healthcare and education. Provinces who do not contribute to the program are referred to as have-not provinces, and provinces that do contribute are considered have provinces. Equalization payments are made up of the following categories: personal income taxes, business taxes, consumption taxes, natural resource revenue, and property and miscellaneous. The have-not provinces for 2017 are as follows: Quebec, $11.08 billion, Manitoba, $1.82 billion, Nova Scotia, $1.77 billion, New Brunswick, $1.76 billion, Ontario, $1.42 billion, and PEI, $390 million. In 2017, New Brunswick equalization payments made up 18.5% of total provincial revenue, and in PEI, 20.6%. Economist Michael Smart has argued that this gives the have-not provinces an incentive to raise taxes, because any harm brought on by higher taxes is offset by higher equalization payments. Hence the coined term, a race to the bottom. It is true that Albertans experience an overall higher net income per capita than most other Canadians. However, Albertans sent $49 billion worth of taxes to Ottawa in 2016 and only received $27.2 billion back in the form of federal spending. This means that Alberta's net contribution in 2017 was $21.8 billion.
The energy sector provides through taxation and revenue to governments, builds hospitals, it provides the social programs a lot of Canadians would define themselves as unique in, like universal health care. So when people try and make this about a regionalized debate, it's about Alberta or about Calgary, I disagree, because the wealth and prosperity that the natural resources sector provides to Canada translates to me very simply. It's a strong Alberta means a strong Canada.
I think provinces need to have, a certain level of jurisdiction about what happens in their own provinces and how their provincial, economy is affected, how their taxpayers and voters are affected, and families in those different provinces are affected. But we are part of a federation, and so if we are going to be a federation, and that federation is Canada, we have to have rules about how products move freely across provincial boundaries. If each province was free to set its own rules, so if BC set its own rules, Alberta did, Saskatchewan, the next step is simply setting up, border stations where you collect import taxes coming in and out of each province. It'd be simply like going to the United States. So driving to BC would be like driving to the United States. You'd go through some sort of customs toll booth, if you will, if we didn't have a federal oversight that said, you need to all play nicely because that's in the benefit of Canada as a whole.
We cannot have a country that's balkanized so that you stop the train at the border of Manitoba and Saskatchewan and a new crew go on and you charge a toll to go through Manitoba and then another toll when you get to Ontario. We can't have a highway system where trucks have to stop at every provincial border, be inspected, and then have to pay a toll to go through the next province. And we shouldn't have a pipeline system where we can't flow oil and gas across the country without somebody holding us up for ransom. I can understand the frustration in the West. I live in an area in New Brunswick where we do not have access to gas or oil. And we're sitting there separated from the rest of Canada by Quebec, and we cannot get access to Canadian resources. And it's impoverishing us. So I understand the frustration. I also think that Canadians aren't going to put up with this forever. People in the West, for example, in resource-producing areas, at some point are just going to rebel and say, this is not right.
Build that pipe! Build that pipe!
So you did a lot of digging, and you found there's money coming from the United States in large amounts, and the money is being directed to specific groups and organizations which will get in the way of pipelines, the development of natural resources. What did you find out? How did you come on it, and who should we be most concerned about? Where should the focus be?
I just stumbled by accident across a large number of payments for a thing called the tar sands campaign. This was back in 2010. And at first, of course, there was absolutely no publicly available information about it. So we had no way of knowing what it is. This tar sands campaign, we didn't know. Was it against Gateway? Was it against the Keystone Pipeline? But of course, what's happened over the last 7 years is more information has come to light. And in fact, last fall, the individual who has been directing this campaign now for more than a decade, his name is Michael Marks, he put on the website of one of the organizations that from the very beginning, the campaign strategy was to, and I quote, landlock the tar sands crude to keep it out of international markets where it could fetch a high price per barrel.
There are people now starting to ask questions about the motivation and the funding sources for some of the groups that are making the loudest noises. And some pretty strong research is showing a lot of the funding is coming in from environmental groups in the United States. And, that's pretty ironic considering the United States is the biggest beneficiary of blocking all of our projects. People should start putting two and two together and realize that the United States, both the activist community and probably the resource community, have a vested interest in tying Canada up solid, which is what they've done.
Our reputation, kind of has been dragged through the mud on the oil and gas sector. You look around the world right now, there's a couple thousand oil tankers transiting the oceans from point A to point B, from countries that don't have carbon pricing initiatives. Canada's the only top 10 oil exporter with carbon pricing initiatives. And that actually started in 2007. So we have taken a leadership role on this file at every possible point, and we have not been given the credit by these environmental groups, for that leadership. And as Canadians, I think it's just time that we need to really make our voices heard and be a part of this conversation.
So, yeah, no question that Jane Fondas of this world, the Capris of this world have basically, come along and made got a lot of attention because they flew in one day and looked over the oil sands projects along with some chiefs. I mean, that's fine, but it doesn't put food on the table. It does not put any results in our community. So I say we work with the environmental groups, whether they're First Nations or non-First Nations, and as well as First Nations. Let's come to an understanding that we need each other. We got to work with each other.
It's up to governments to sift through all of the noise and figure out what the common good is, and that's hard to do because all of the activists would say, pick us. We're on the good side here. But governments have to have a more balanced view, and they don't always have that balanced view. And for that reason, what we're doing here in Canada, we're basically shutting down the voices of the resource industries, which aren't very loud to start with, and listening to the voices of activists who say, we want more process, we want more regulation. When if you put the question to them, if we had another 5 years to listen to you, would you still accept building a pipeline, for example? They would say, no, we'll never accept it, but we do want to take more time so that we can slow your project down. As leaders, we have got to break through those impasses and deliver the right results for Canada, which is a balance. I'm a big believer in carbon taxation. I'm a big believer in environmental regulations. I'm a big believer, though, that the world will not move away from fossil fuels over the next year or two. And countries like Russia and the United States are dramatically ramping up their production to fill the needs of a growing world. Canada should not be left behind in this. It's a vaporization of national wealth of a stunning scale, and one that we should not be party to.
We need to have this happen right across the board, especially now with the issue around with issue of pipelines and tidewater access.
Yes.
I think that's key right now. So we can move this oil to Asia, India. We can get a better price for our oil. It'll lift the price of oil in Alberta, in Saskatchewan. It'll create more jobs. It'll create more jobs in BC. It'll create more jobs actually across the country.
The Kinder Morgan pipeline is an example. There are more Indigenous communities supporting that pipeline than opposed to it. You would never know that from the rhetoric, because the environmentalists always want to find a First Nations person and hold them up there in front of them as a shield. And I don't think it's right.
When I was Minister of State for Western Economic Diversification, one of the priorities that I put in place in the ministry was First Nation economic participation in the natural resource economy, because there are many job opportunities that can be leveraged there should duty to consult and the right framework be put in place through an appropriate relationship.
If you look at what's happened in Norway, how they got there, they became the wealthiest country on a per capita basis in the world, basically. Is They got everybody together. They got the indigenous peoples, the environmentalists, they got the corporations, they got the government, all in one room. And they made an arrangement, they made the deal. They have ships, they've got offshore they got offshore drilling locations offshore. People are fishing in those waters. So there's a way to figure this out.
So the really interesting fact that almost no Canadian would know is that at the same time that we cannot get our Western oil or our Western gas to any market except the United States of America, our refineries in Eastern Canada cannot get access to a lick of Canadian gas or oil and are exporting their oil and gas from some of the most despotic regimes in the entire world. 700,000 barrels a day coming in large ships into Eastern Canada, bringing oil at world prices, not these puny little Western prices, world prices are coming in to fuel our refineries. Now, anybody in Canada who would understand that would have to be sickened by it and just say, this isn't right. We're paying a world price, bringing oil from some regimes that would make you blush around the world, and at the same time, our Western gas can't find a market. There's something fundamentally wrong here.
So for oil, I mean, we're importing oil into two areas of the country today. One is we are importing a little bit into British Columbia, but not much, and that's primarily in the form of petroleum products. So we actually are importing diesel, for example, into British Columbia. We're not manufacturing enough diesel in Western Canada to currently supply British Columbia, and so there's some arrangements there to bring diesel, about 20,000 barrels a day on an annual average basis in British Columbia. The other place that we bring a lot of product into, and a lot of crude more specifically, is into Eastern Canada, New Brunswick in particular. So we have the Irving refinery in New Brunswick. They need about 300,000 barrels a day of oil. We also have a refinery in Quebec that's owned and operated by Valero, which also imports oil because it's not pipeline connected to the west of Canada. So we're importing about 500,000 barrels a day of oil. Now we're exporting much more than that, so we are a large net exporter, but nonetheless we are still importing a significant volume of oil. On the natural gas side of things, we're importing, again, a little bit of natural gas into Ontario, into Quebec. We're probably importing about 10% of what we are consuming in Canada is coming from the eastern United States. I think there's a desire in Quebec, for example, to actually increase the amount of natural gas they can import from the United States because it's viewed as being more cost effective. But again, ironically, that gas doesn't incur a carbon tax. So one of the reasons it is cheaper is because it doesn't have that tax.
The next component of the discussion is what should our targets be in Canada and why? And I don't think that we've ever, I mean, of any political stripe, we haven't gotten that right. The current targets, I think it is fair to say, okay, well, what role does Canada have to play in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions at home domestically, given that we are such a small component of global emissions? But then I start looking at more complicated issues, like when Justin Trudeau wanted to start free trade negotiations with China this year. Well, China has a very poor record on greenhouse gas emissions and implementing concrete policies that would reduce that. So if we're going to increase our demand for Chinese products, Are we enabling more greenhouse gas emissions by having Canadians say, well, we're going to have more appetite for products that have been produced under less strict greenhouse gas emissions? More importantly, I think we also have to ask Canadians what price they're willing to pay to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think that we've had an honest conversation with Canadians about that. I think about Ontario, where the whole green energy plan, which is I would say is a resounding failure. A lot of those costs were hidden in these sneaky little lines on hydro bills.
How does efficiency play into our future goals of reducing global CO2 emissions?
Efficiency, I believe, is the real crux to achieving a low-carbon environment, a low-carbon economy. There's so much debate over whether we should do oil and gas or renewables. We're never going to achieve a low-carbon economy by constantly adding energy. We have to use it more efficiently. Today, when you look at all the energy we use, and this is true in around the world, Canada, the United States, when you look at all the energy we use, we actually utilize about a third for our intended purpose, to crux to achieving a low carbon. Our iPhone to heat our homes and office buildings, 2/3 is wasted as waste heat. This comes out of the exhaust pipe of your car, the radiator of your car, chimneys in our homes, into the rivers, lakes, and oceans at our power plants in cooling the water used to create power. So we're never going to achieve a low carbon economy by just adding more energy. We have to get more efficient. We can't waste 2/3 of the energy we use and ever expect to accomplish our goals. Yet we don't talk about that much about energy efficiency. We're too busy throwing buns at each other over the whole source of energy debate. And we have to bring efficiency to the forefront of the discussion. The oil and gas debate's become terribly polarized. Again, when you're living in a life of privilege, you think, well, let's have all renewables, let's get rid of oil and gas. It's not that simple. If it was that simple, it would be done by now. We need all types of energy, and this polarized argument of it's all this, it's all that, is fundamentally naive. Each type of energy has its own pros and cons. Renewable is a great source of energy, but it's very intermittent. Whether it's wind or solar, whether there's wind or whether there's sunlight, cloudy days, nighttime, you can't rely entirely on renewables. We need primarily natural gas as a base load. Natural gas, nuclear, hydro, all these others can be more base load. So that, again, it's all of the above. They complement each other. There's no single solution to all our energy requirements.
There's that wonderful line in I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King where it seems impossible for him to comprehend that we can have islands of poverty in this vast ocean of prosperity. Why can it not be shared? And it's something that when I hear that, I think it's so beautifully put, and why should there be these pockets of poverty only based on our past? Let's tear those walls down.
There's a country who could be an example of that. To make that happen is Canada.
Canada, to me, is the most principled and transparent country in the world. We often see our neighbors to the south create songs and create movies on US patriotism. However, it seems as Canadians that we get wrapped up in what other countries are doing, and we forget to look within our own borders for security and strength. We are blessed to have a strong natural resource sector, and as Canadians, we should not be ashamed of supporting one of the most important industries in Canada. The success of the Canadian oil and gas industry and our domestic environmental concerns can coexist. However, what we are seeing is a political breakdown of cooperation between provinces.
If the special interest groups were successful in shutting down the oil and gas sector, it would have two huge impacts on this country. One is just the employment and GDP, the contribution of the energy industry. But secondly, just our lives would change dramatically. Our quality of life would go down dramatically because our access to energy would decrease and become more expensive. And emissions would not be affected one little bit. So why would we ever want to do that?
So it's really important that we take a new step going forward, a new direction going forward. If we don't stand up for ourselves as Canadians, no one else is coming to save us.
And the next step basically is equity. Equity in a sense that First Nations, Indigenous peoples have a stake in the resource space.
I mean, Canada, again, and it's not to say we don't want to be leaders, but again, we only account for 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the oil sands industry in particular, it's less than 0.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So even if you doubled it, it's relatively insignificant in the scheme of things. Whereas if you looked at coal-fired plant generations out of the state of Wisconsin in the United States, they are larger than the totality of the oil sands emissions. So I think you need to start to see, or the public needs to start to see some of these comparisons on an apples-to-apples basis to start to get a better idea of what we do in Canada, how well we do it in Canada, and how it stacks up to the rest of the world.
So when people try and make this about a regionalized debate that's about Alberta or about Calgary, I disagree, because the wealth and prosperity that the natural resources sector provides to Canada translates to me very simply. It's a strong Alberta means a strong Canada.
I want Canadians to think about this issue on a local level, but to also think about their provincial neighbors. I believe that we need to be more united on this topic. We need to have the correct information and to stop vilifying an industry that has provided a commodity we all take for granted.
We're a country. Now, when I was Premier of New Brunswick, I was really proud of that. But there wasn't a day in my life when I couldn't say I'm a Canadian first and a New Brunswicker second.